The air is thin. The clock is ticking. On September 30th, 1955, one of the most iconic men in Hollywood is about to die. On a road he thought he knew better than anyone else. He didn't see it coming. Or perhaps in a dark, quiet corner of his soul, a place carved out by grief and abandonment, he had seen it coming his entire life. A car, another man, his future slipping away in a brutal instant of twisted metal and shattered glass. The year is 1955. America is a nation holding its breath, caught between the chrome-plated optimism of the post-war boom and the creeping paranoia of the Cold War. It is a world of gray flannel suits and carefully manicured lawns. But beneath this placid surface, a new energy is beginning to simmer. It is the birth of the teenager, a restless, yearning generation searching for a voice. On a ribbon of asphalt designated California State Route 466, that voice is about to be silenced, and in that silence transformed into a legend, a silver ghost is flying down the highway. It's a Porsche 550 Spider, a rare and ferocious machine, one of only 90 ever made. But that car, so sleek, so new, wasn't just a machine to its 24-year-old driver, it was a declaration. It was his escape from the suffocating grip of a fame he never truly wanted. It was his claim to freedom, the one place where the carefully constructed myth of James Dean could be shed, leaving only the man, the engine, and the open road. It was the very thing that promised him the speed to outrun the ghosts of his past. Yet as a boy still learning to walk in the shadows of his own burgeoning legend, was he truly ready to outrun his destiny? Ahead, a 1950 Ford Tudor begins a slow, lumbering turn, a black shape against the blinding glare of the setting sun. In the split second between destiny and oblivion, James Dean is said to have uttered his last words, a calm, almost casual observation born of a racer's confidence. "That guy's gotta stop. He'll see us." He didn't. The impact is catastrophic, a sickening final crunch of metal and bone. Was this a crash he never saw coming, or was it an appointment he had been racing toward all along? The answer was not born on the highway. It began years earlier, in the sun-drenched promise of Santa Monica, and was sealed on a cold, lonely train ride to the flatlands of Indiana. It began with a wound that would never, ever heal. Born James Byron Dean. In 1931, his earliest years were bathed in a unique and precious light. This light emanated from his mother, Mildred Wilson Dean. While his father, Winton, was a quiet and emotionally reserved dental technician, Mildred was a vibrant force who saw the burgeoning artist in her sensitive son. She didn't just encourage him, she actively cultivated his talents. She enrolled him in tap dance classes, painstakingly taught him the violin, and in their small home built an elaborate puppet theater where young Jimmy could stage his own dramas, losing himself in worlds of his own making. She read him poetry, took him to see plays, and mirrored his own intense artistic soul back at him. For 9 years, she was his entire world, a fortress of unconditional love and understanding. And then, the fortress crumbled. Mildred was diagnosed with uterine cancer, and her decline was swift and agonizing. Her death in 1940 was a devastating blow, but the true defining trauma was not the loss itself, but the act of abandonment that followed. Winton, a man adrift in his own grief and utterly incapable of parenting his intensely emotional son, made a decision that would forever scar Dean's psyche. He sent him away. He put his 9-year-old motherless son on a train, dispatching him back to the Midwest to be raised by his aunt and uncle, Hortense and Marcus Winslow, on their Quaker farm in Fairmount, Indiana. It was the same train that carried his mother's body in a casket in the baggage car. Imagine that journey. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, the American landscape scrolling past the window, and the chilling knowledge that the source of all your love and safety is lying cold in a box just a few cars away. while the one parent you have left has deemed you an inconvenience. This was the primal wound. He was an orphan whose father was still alive. This feeling of being disposable, of being shipped away with the dead like unwanted luggage, would become the engine of his art and the fuel for his rebellion. Every tantrum, every mumbled line, every desperate on-screen plea for love was an echo of that train ride. Life on the farm with his quiet, devout Quaker relatives, Hortense and Marcus Winslow, was stable but emotionally sterile. A world away from the expressive warmth his mother had provided. He became a study in contradictions, a popular athlete who was also a solitary dreamer. He found a crucial mentor in his high school drama teacher, Adeline Nall, who gave him a stage for his turmoil. But it was a local Methodist pastor, Reverend James DeWeerd, who introduced him to the darker, more thrilling disciplines that would become central to his character. DeWeerd, a man with a flair for the dramatic and a history of world travel, became a surrogate father figure, but one who nurtured Dean's edge rather than his conformity. It was DeWeerd who introduced the boy to the concept of bullfighting. He would show Dean films of the great Spanish matadors like Manolete, explaining the philosophy behind the spectacle. It was not mere sport, it was a tragedy in 3 acts, a ritual of life and death. The matador, with his graceful, almost balletic movements, stood as a symbol of absolute control and artistry in the face of brute, chaotic force. He did not run from death. He danced with it, bringing it dangerously close, mastering his own fear until the moment of truth. For a boy like Dean, who felt a chaotic rage churning inside him, this idea of channeling inner turmoil into a controlled, beautiful, and dangerous performance was a revelation. It provided a philosophical framework for the life he would go on to lead, both on screen and on the racetrack. This fascination with mortal risk quickly found a more accessible outlet: the motorcycle. DeWeerd encouraged this passion, and soon Dean was a familiar sight, a leather-clad blur on the back roads of Indiana, pushing his Czech motorcycle to its limits. This was his first taste of the freedom he would later seek in his Porsche. It was a physical release, a way to feel powerful, to outrun the quiet desperation of his small-town life. This love of danger was being seeded deep within him, the belief that life was only truly lived at the very edge of its own extinction. Fueled by this complex mixture of pain and a burgeoning need for risk, Dean left Indiana. He was determined to become an actor, not for the glamour, but for the desperate need to be seen, to be understood, to make his inner chaos mean something. His early years back in California and then in New York were a humbling gauntlet of rejection. He worked as a parking lot attendant, took bit parts, and often starved. But he was also building something, a persona. He was crafting the idea of James Dean, the tortured artist, a protective shell for the wounded boy from Indiana. He was learning to perform his pain before he ever had a major role. His breakthrough didn't happen overnight. It happened in the flickering, high-pressure world of early live television. Before his film stardom, Dean appeared in dozens of television anthology dramas, shows like Kraft Television Theater, Studio One, and General Electric Theater. This was his true proving ground. In an era before videotape, these dramas were performed live to the entire nation, like miniature stage plays broadcast into millions of homes. The pressure was immense. There were no second takes. For a young actor, it was terrifying, but for Dean, it was electrifying. It was in this environment that his raw, unpredictable style began to get noticed. In a 1954 episode of General Electric Theater titled The Dark, Dark Hours, he played a menacing young delinquent who holds an older doctor, played by a future U.S. President Ronald Reagan, hostage. Where other actors of the era were polished and precise, Dean was a bundle of nervous energy. He mumbled, he improvised, He moved with a restless, animalistic quality that was completely alien to television at the time. You couldn't take your eyes off him because you never knew what he would do next. He wasn't just reciting lines, he was living them, creating a palpable sense of danger that made his co-stars, including Reagan, visibly uneasy. His salvation came when he was accepted into the legendary Actors Studio in New York. Under the tutelage of the formidable Lee Strasberg, he found a place where the wound of his father's rejection could be weaponized. The method wasn't a technique for him. It was permission. It was a validation of his belief that true art came from a place of authentic suffering. He could dredge up the grief, the rage, the feeling of abandonment and channel it into a brutal, undeniable on-screen honesty. His classmates, a who's who of future stars like Eli Wallach, Julie Harris, and Shelley Winters, were both mesmerized and terrified by his intensity in class exercises. He would become so lost in a scene that he would often break down in tears or erupt in fury, blurring the line between performance and reality. His intense, one-sided rivalry with Marlon Brando was legendary, a mix of hero worship and a desperate need to surpass the man who had first broken the mold. But Dean wasn't just trying to be a great actor, he was trying to exorcise a ghost. He was still that 9-year-old boy, trying to get a reaction from a father who wouldn't look at him. And now, the entire world was about to become his stage. The director who would give that inner chaos its grandest stage was Elia Kazan. By the mid-1950s, Kazan was one of the most powerful and respected directors in Hollywood, a master of pulling raw, authentic performances from his actors in films like A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. He was also one of its most controversial figures, having named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, an act that left him a pariah in many circles. Kazan, a rebel in his own right, was preparing to film John Steinbeck's epic East of Eden, and he was searching for an actor to play Cal Trask, the dark, brooding, unloved son who stands in the shadow of his favored brother. He had tested dozens of handsome, promising young actors, including Paul Newman. But Kazan felt Newman was too self-assured, too complete. He was looking for someone who was genuinely broken. He found it when a scruffy, seemingly indifferent James Dean walked into his office, kicked off his shoes, and put his feet up on Kazan's desk. Kazan later wrote that Dean had a grudge against all fathers, and that the moment he met him, the search was over. Dean was Cal Trask. The role was not a performance. It was a public possession, a cinematic exorcism of the demons that had haunted him since that fateful train ride. The set of East of Eden became the arena for a war Dean had been fighting privately his entire life. The unwitting target was the veteran actor Raymond Massey, a distinguished, classically trained British thespian who played his stern, righteous father, Adam Trask. To Dean, Massey wasn't a co-star, he was a surrogate for Winton, the father who had sent him away, a symbol of every cold, unloving authority figure he had ever known. He began a campaign of psychological warfare, not out of malice, but out of a desperate method-fueled need to provoke a genuine reaction. He would deliberately mumble lines, change his blocking without warning, and maintain a hostile distance off-camera, even speaking to Massey only through intermediaries, all in an attempt to break through Massey's impenetrable wall of professionalism and force him into a real, messy father-son conflict. The gentle actress Julie Harris, who played Cal's love interest Abra, often found herself the reluctant mediator, witnessing Dean's tormented process firsthand. She saw both the maddening difficulty and the breathtaking genius. He was mercurial, brilliant, and a pain in the neck, she recalled, but she also saw the deep well of sadness that fueled his work. The on-screen dynamic with his good brother Aaron, played by Richard Davalos, was equally complex. Dean played Cal's jealousy with a painful undercurrent of love and a desperate desire for the acceptance his brother received so effortlessly. A pivotal sequence in the film is Cal's discovery that his mother, long thought dead, is alive and running a brothel in a nearby town. The scenes where he confronts her are a direct parallel to his own life. A boy searching for a lost mother, only to find a complicated and painful reality. His performance in these moments is astonishingly raw. You can see the hope, fear, and ultimate disappointment warring in his eyes. But the on-set psychodrama reached its devastating climax in the film's most powerful scene. Cal, having earned thousands of dollars growing beans to save the family from financial ruin, decides to give the money to his father as a birthday gift. It is a desperate, almost childlike attempt to finally buy the love and approval he has craved his entire life. Adam, a man of rigid moral principles, is appalled that his son earned the money through what he considers war profiteering. Every bit of that money is blood money, and cruelly rejects the gift, telling Cal to give it back. The script then called for Cal to turn and walk away in despair. Instead, in a moment of pure, unscripted agony that stunned the cast and crew into silence, Dean lunged forward and grabbed Massey, clutching the older actor in a desperate, sobbing embrace. It was the primal scream of the 9-year-old boy on the train, a raw, painful, and utterly captivating display of emotional nakedness. The public saw a brilliant performance. In reality, they were watching a young man break down, using a Warner Brothers film set to confront the ghost of his father. When East of Eden was released in March 1955, the world was mesmerized. The line between James Dean and Cal Trask blurred and then vanished entirely. This was the birth of the myth, the moment the public began to consume the man, believing the pain on screen was not art, but a direct window into his soul. The New York Times critic Bosley Crowther, while slightly bewildered by Dean's mannerisms, called him an actor who is a mass of histrionic gingerbread. But the youth of America didn't see affectation. They saw truth. He had shown them his wound, and they had mistaken it for entertainment. His next film would transform that raw wound into a global symbol. If East of Eden made him a star, Rebel Without a Cause made him an immortal. The screenplay was loosely based on a 1944 psychiatric study of a criminal psychopath, but director Nicholas Ray transformed the clinical material into a poetic, compassionate, and visually stunning tragedy. Set against the backdrop of rising public anxiety about juvenile delinquency, Ray's film refused to condemn its characters, instead pointing a finger at the emotional failures of the post-war parent generation. At its center was Dean as Jim Stark, a character so intertwined with his own persona that it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. Here, the man versus myth conflict intensified. The iconic red Harrington jacket, the plain white t-shirt, the brooding stare, the mumbled vulnerability. It all coalesced into an armor of cool. The world saw a rebel, but the rebellion was born of a desperate need for connection. Jim Stark's famous anguished cry to his parents, "You're tearing me apart," was the howl of an entire generation. But more specifically, it was a cry aimed squarely at his real father, Winton. Jim's on-screen father, played by Jim Backus, is a weak, ineffectual man, often seen wearing a frilly apron, a symbol of emasculated, ineffectual masculinity. Everything Dean feared and resented in his own father. The on-screen trio of Dean, Natalie Wood as Judy, and Sal Mineo as Plato, formed a broken surrogate family, clinging to each other because their own families had failed them. Their chemistry was electric because it was authentic. Dennis Hopper, who had a small role in the film, later spoke of being in awe of Dean's process. "I had never seen an actor act like that," Hopper recalled. "He was a guerrilla artist. He was doing something that I'd never seen before, which was behaving. Hopper witnessed Dean's method firsthand. The intensity, the improvisation, the way he would use his own emotional turmoil to fuel a scene, changing the landscape for every other actor in the room. The film's visual language was as expressive as its performances. Nicholas Ray used the wide cinemascope frame to emphasize the characters' isolation, often placing them at the edges of the screen. The use of color was symbolic. Jim's passionate red jacket, Judy's seductive red lipstick, and in the final scenes, Plato's single mismatched red sock, a small, heartbreaking symbol of his desperate desire to belong to their makeshift family. The film cemented Dean as a global icon, but the myth was now a cage. He reportedly hated being called a rebel and grew frustrated that people were unable to separate him from his characters. He had given the world a hero for the misunderstood, but in doing so, he had become a prisoner of his own reflection. He was already looking for a way to break out. His escape attempt was his third and final film, Giant. It was a conscious decision to destroy the teenage rebel persona. He took on the supporting role of Jet Rink, a resentful ranch hand in an epic Texas saga, a film that would see him age from a young outcast into a lonely, pathetic, alcoholic tycoon. The film's director, George Stevens, was the stylistic opposite of Kazan. He was a meticulous, patient craftsman who would shoot scenes over and over from dozens of angles, a process Dean found both excruciatingly slow and deeply challenging. The role of Jet Rink became a dark character study. Jet is an embodiment of the American dream curdled into a nightmare, a man who achieves immense wealth through oil but finds only spiritual poverty. Dean meticulously crafted Jet's physical and vocal transformation over decades. He used his entire body to show the passage of time, a subtle stoop that grows more pronounced, a confident swagger that decays into a weary shuffle, a clear voice that thickens into a drunken slur. It was a complex technical performance that proved his range far beyond the realm of teenage angst. On the sprawling Texas set, he was as difficult and unpredictable as ever, clashing with the old-school professionalism of Rock Hudson. But he found a deep and immediate friendship with Elizabeth Taylor. She, a fellow former child star, saw past the myth. She saw the boy, not the icon, the sensitive, insecure, and often childlike man who was struggling under the weight of his own legend. They shared a dark sense of humor and spent late nights talking, with Dean often confiding his deepest fears and insecurities to her. He was an original, she would later say. There was a core of him that was so confused and childlike. I think he was lonely. His final performance in the film is an eerie prophecy. As the older drunken Jet, he is set to give a great speech at a banquet in his own honor, but collapses in a pathetic, incoherent stupor. It became known as the Last Supper scene. Dean, fully in character, was legitimately drunk, his slurred words a portrait of hollow success. It was a terrifyingly honest depiction of a man who had gained the world but lost his soul. With his work on Giant complete, his contract fulfilled, the actor's work was done. He had created 3 legendary performances in less than 2 years. He had shown them the wounded son, the iconic rebel, and the broken tycoon. Now the man himself was free, and he turned his full, obsessive attention to the one thing that promised pure, unscripted reality: the roar of an engine, the blur of the open road, and the beautiful silver machine that he called Little Bastard. James Dean's love for the Porsche 550 Spider was not a hobby. It was an act of worship. This was not just a car. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of the themes that governed his life. It was the logical conclusion of his fascination with the deadly grace of the bullfight and the controlled chaos of the racetrack. The love of danger that Reverend DeWeird had nurtured in Indiana had found its perfect lethal vessel. The car was a symbol of his frenzied need for escape, the peak of his pride, and ultimately an instrument of self-destruction. In its polished silver body, he saw a reflection of his own desire, to move so fast that the ghosts of his past couldn't keep up. This obsession was so intense that it seemed to radiate a dark energy. Just a week before his death, he filmed a short highway safety spot for the National Safety Council. Dressed as his giant character Jet Rink, he ended the interview by looking into the camera and ad-libbing the chillingly ironic line, "The life you save may be mine." Days later, on September 23rd, he was having dinner at the Villa Capri, his favorite Hollywood restaurant, when he ran into the esteemed British actor Alec Guinness. Full of boyish excitement, Dean insisted on showing Guinness his new prize, which was parked outside. Guinness, a man not given to flights of fancy, took one look at the sleek silver car and was struck by a powerful, inexplicable premonition. "I heard myself saying in a voice I could hardly recognize as my own," he later recalled, "Please do not get into that car. If you do, you will be found dead in it by this time next week." Dean just laughed, dismissing the warning as the eccentric rambling of a stuffy old British actor. He had chosen his destiny, and it smelled of gasoline and hot metal. The morning of September 30th, the day of the crash, began with a fateful change of plans. The original intention was to tow the Spider to the Salinas race on a trailer, but Dean, ever the purist, insisted on driving it himself. He wanted to break in the new engine, to feel the car's every vibration, to become one with the machine before competing. He set out from Hollywood with his mechanic Rolf Wüthrich and was followed by his friend, the photographer Sanford Roth, who was documenting the trip for a magazine story. At 3:30 p.m. on the notorious Grapevine stretch of Route 99, Dean was pulled over and given a speeding ticket. It was a mundane, bureaucratic warning, another sign from the universe that he ignored. A little over an hour later, they made a final stop at Blackwell's Corner for a Coca-Cola and an apple. It was the last thing he would ever eat. Then they merged back onto the highway, racing toward the setting sun. After the crash, the story should have ended, but the car, little bastard, seemed to disagree. The mangled wreck, purchased by car customizer George Barris, began to generate a dark folklore of its own, as if the violent energy of its owner's demise had been permanently imprinted upon it. The curse began almost immediately. A mechanic's legs were crushed when the wreck slipped from a trailer in Barris's workshop. Despite this ominous event, Barris, a man who understood the morbid value of celebrity artifacts, sold off parts of the car to other amateur racers. The powerful engine was sold to Dr. Troy McHenry, a successful Beverly Hills surgeon who raced cars as a weekend passion. During a race in Pomona, McHenry lost control of his own race car, now powered by the Porsche's engine, and was killed instantly when it slammed into a tree. In the very same race, another driver, William Eschrid, a surgeon from Burbank, had bought the transmission from Little Bastard. His car locked up and flipped over during a corner, leaving him with serious injuries from which he would eventually recover, though he never raced again. The legend grew with each macabre incident. 2 tires from the Spider, which had miraculously survived the crash, were sold to a young man in New York. According to the story, both tires blew out simultaneously, sending his car skidding off the road. A young thief who tried to steal the blood-stained steering wheel from the stored wreckage supposedly slipped and gashed his arm. Barris, now thoroughly spooked and unable to sell the chassis, loaned it to the National Safety Council to be used in a traveling exhibit to promote highway safety. A grimly ironic purpose for a car that had become a symbol of death. But the curse went on tour. In Sacramento, the garage housing the exhibit caught fire, destroying everything inside, except the car itself, which survived with little more than a smudge of soot. In Oregon, the truck transporting the wreck was involved in a mysterious accident that killed its driver, George Barkuis. Barquis was a family man, a professional driver simply doing his job, who was thrown from the cab and in a final act of morbid irony, was reportedly impaled by the very wreckage he was hauling. On at least 2 separate occasions, the car simply fell from its display stands, in one instance, breaking a teenager's hip. Of course, a skeptic would argue that this is merely a string of tragic coincidences, amplified by grief and the human need for myth. Amateur racing in the 1950s was exceptionally dangerous, a sport with high fatality rates where mechanical failures were common. It stands to reason that using salvaged parts from a high-impact wreck, parts that could have hairline stress fractures invisible to the naked eye, would be inherently risky. Confirmation bias, too, plays a role. Every subsequent accident involving a piece of the car was seen as proof of the curse, while any instance of a part functioning normally went unrecorded. The stories, they argue, are a collection of coincidences and rumors, a way for a grieving public to make sense of a senseless tragedy by imbuing it with supernatural meaning. But this rational view cannot account for the final chapter. After years of its grim tour, Barris wanted the car returned. In 1960, the wreckage was loaded into a sealed boxcar in Miami to be shipped by train back to Los Angeles. When the train arrived at its destination and the sealed boxcar was opened, it was empty. The wreck of Little Bastard had vanished. No official report was ever filed. No trace of it has ever been found. It was a final supernatural disappearing act that cemented the curse in the annals of dark American folklore, leaving the world to decide between rational explanation and a chilling legend. Decades later, James Dean remains an immortal fixture in our cultural landscape. Why? Because the themes of his life, the psychological wounds and the defiant rebellion, are timeless. His influence on the craft of acting was seismic. He broke the mold of the stoic, hyper-masculine Hollywood hero. He, along with Brando, opened the door for a new kind of leading man. Vulnerable, neurotic, and emotionally complex. This paved the way for the great actors of the new Hollywood in the 1970s like Pacino and De Niro, who built their careers on the kind of raw, introspective intensity that Dean had pioneered. The dangerous romantic myth of the artist who dies for his art in many ways started with him. His cultural footprint extends far beyond cinema. The uniform of the plain white t-shirt, blue jeans, and leather jacket became a global symbol of a break from the gray flannel conformity of the 1950s. The attitude of misunderstood rebellion he embodied became the template for the rock and roll ethos of Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, and countless others. He helped shift the definition of cool from the suave, unflappable confidence of a Cary Grant to something moody, introspective, and sensitive. His very image, captured in the candid, melancholic photographs of Dennis Stock, created a new kind of celebrity portraiture, one based on intimacy rather than glamour. Yet his story remains riddled with personal mysteries that fuel his legend. His intense, thwarted love for actress Pier Angeli, whose mother forced her into a more suitable marriage, left him heartbroken. Angeli herself later tragically confessed that Dean was the only man she had ever truly loved, and the persistent, well-documented accounts from various biographers of his relationships with men paint a picture of a soul in deep conflict, navigating his identity in a brutally repressive and homophobic era. This adds a profound layer to his on-screen angst. His rebellion was not just against cinematic fathers, but against a society that demanded he perform a singular, acceptable version of himself, both on and off screen. In the end, all the threads of his life lead back to that final, fateful turn on Route 466. The primal father wound was the source of his pain. His cultivated love of danger was the addiction he used to numb it. The Porsche was his chosen instrument, his beautiful, shiny death car. These forces created the myth of James Dean, a persona so powerful that it began to consume the man. The crash, therefore, was not an accident, but an inevitability, the only possible resolution for a man whose escape vehicle was aimed directly at his own legend. It was the moment his desperate flight from his own image became the very act that made it immortal. It was the moment James Dean, the boy from Indiana, finally stopped running and became a permanent, unchangeable idea, forever young, forever defiant, forever racing toward a horizon we can never reach.